Welcome to part 4, which is locking down your V speed. What is a V speed? Well, the V comes from the word velocity. So it's the velocity at which you are flying the aircraft. And we have certain restrictions based on certain conditions or certain numbers we must know in order to get certain performance aspects of the aircraft. So starting at the very top here, we have Vx. Vx being your best angle of climb. Now what does that mean? That means for a given distance, how much vertical distance can we gain, which we call altitude. So in the shortest amount of distance, how can we go the highest in the air, get the most altitude? And that is going to be 58 knots in our Pipistrel Alpha trainer. Now, next is going to be Vy. What is that? Now that is best rate of climb. Now what that means is in a given amount of time, how much altitude can we gain? So in the shortest amount of time, I want to gain the most amount of altitude. Seems like a pretty important number, right? Well, it is. In our aircraft, that is 76 knots. Next, we're talking about VREF. Now that is going to be your final approach speed. Traditionally, the calculation is used 1.3 times VSO. In a minute, we'll talk about what VSO is. What we want you to fly in our aircraft is going to be 60 knots. So it's an important speed we want you to have remembered because you must be flying that speed on final in order for you to touch down in a smooth manner at the point in which you desire to touch down at. Now going back to the other side, we have VR, which is going to be your rotation speed. Now rotation just means the point at which you lift off the runway. In our aircraft, the rotation speed is 55 knots. Now we do start to lightly pull back on the stick at 50, but the official rotation speed is 55 knots. So you do not want to leave ground effect before 55 knots, which is something we'll get into in later lessons. Next we have VFE. So that is velocity of flaps extended. So the speed at which you're flying when you're going to extend your flaps. We have two flap settings, flaps +1, flaps +2. For flaps +1, the number is 70 knots. What does that mean for you? That means you must be below 70 knots before you pull flaps 1 on the aircraft. Next we have +2. So if you want to go flaps +2, you must be below 60 knots. So if you are flying at 55, you are fine to pull flaps 2. If you're flying at 65, you are not allowed to pull flaps 2. Right below that, which I've snuck in here, as you can see, is VAE. Now that's not common to most aircrafts. That's specific to ours, especially in general aviation. You don't see this much. This is your air brakes extended velocity. So you cannot turn on your air brakes until you are below 70 knots, according to the POH. And we are going to follow that because otherwise catastrophe can happen. Moving on to the next is VA. VA is going to be your maneuvering speed. In our aircraft, that is 92 knots. Now, maneuvering speed does change based on weight. The lower the weight, the lower the maneuvering speed. We'll talk more about that in a later lesson, but all you have to know for right now is that if we are at full weight, we can fly 92. If we are not at full weight, we'll teach you how to do that calculation later on, but just know that it does change with weight. And maneuvering would be the speed at which you want to perform maneuvers at, and it is the speed at which you can do a full control deflection on any of the flight control surfaces and not potentially damage the aircraft. So a very important speed, especially if you're flying through turbulence. I would always stay below that. Next is VSO. VSO is your stall speed in what we call the dirty configuration. So that means full flaps. So flaps +2. So if you have flaps +2, I like to think of it as VSO. So I think of the flaps being sewed to the runway. Or flaps out, right? So the O is for out. So you want your flaps to be fully in, and then this would be your stall speed. Stall means the point at which the aircraft no longer produces enough lift to support the weight. It doesn't mean it no longer has any lift. It just means that the lift can no longer overcome the weight and you'll start to fall. So that is going to be 42 with flaps fully extended. Next is VS. This is flaps in the clean configuration, which means flaps fully up, flaps 0. And on this aircraft, flaps 0 is going to be 49 knots, at which point you're going to stall. And we just discussed what a stall was. Next, you have VNO. This is known as maximum structural cruising speed. Now, what does this mean? This means This is the fastest you want to go if you're not in completely smooth air. You never want to be above this speed unless you're in completely smooth air, because you can start to damage the aircraft past this speed if it's not totally smooth. So a good number to know. It's also where your yellow arc starts on your airspeed indicator, but that's something we'll get into in another lesson. Next is VNE. That is your velocity never exceed, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It is the speed at which you don't ever fly past, whether you're in a dive, and that's probably the only way you'll ever be able to get to that speed in this aircraft is if you're diving the airplane. But you don't ever want to do that, because that's where you can start to get structural damage and the aircraft can fall apart. And although we have a parachute, we don't want to find out what happens when we pass VNE. We really don't. Next, we have best glide and minimum sink. These are kind of the inverse of VX and VY. So best glide is essentially VY, but for losing altitude. So let's say that we lost our engine. So best glide is going to be 69 knots. So if we lose our engine, we want to immediately pitch for 69 knots so that we can gain the most distance possible for the amount of altitude that we lose. So if we are in our aircraft, our glide ratio is 15:1. So that means for every 1 foot of altitude we lose, we can go 15 feet forward in distance. So what does that mean? Well, let's raise it up to 1,000. That means 1,000 feet of altitude lost. You get to go 15,000 feet. There's roughly 5,000 feet in a mile. So a quick rule of thumb is we get 3 miles for every 1,000 feet of altitude we lose. I would always stay conservative. I would just say 2 miles in any direction. So, or maybe 2.5, let's use 2.5. So if we are, let's say 2,000 feet above the ground, that means that we could go 5 miles in any direction if we lost our engine in order to land in a safe spot. So that is a very important number. Now, we don't plan on losing our engine, but it can happen. It must be something that we are prepared for. Minimum sink. This is going to be essentially like VY. This is going to say you are going to get the most amount of time in the sky for the altitude that you have lost. So if you have lost, let's say you're up at 2,000 feet above the ground again, you want to pitch for, let's say the place you want to land is directly below you, and you actually just want more time in the sky so that you have more time to react, think through how you want to do this, and there's already a safe place to land right below you. I would pitch for minimum sink because that's going to give you the most time in the air to make the best decision before you have to come down and actually land that aircraft. And that concludes our locking down V-Speeds video. Thank you.